Welcome, everyone, to the latest edition in real estate. Well, we are really putting the real talk tonight to good use with our new CEO, Justin Landon, here to talk about none other than the settlement. Justin, thanks for joining us again.
Absolutely. I feel like we're starting to we're getting better at this every time.
It's a rhythm. I'm thinking you're actually one of my best guests now in 2024. You've only been here for like 4 weeks, so I appreciate you being such a good sport. So we had a great kind of town hall meeting last week, kind of talking about the settlement with our membership during our general membership meeting. And man, was it well received. You did a fantastic job kind of pulling together a slide deck of where we kind of are, what we do know, what we don't know, and really going over that. And so we thought, you know what, let's bring it to real talk. Hi, baby. Gotta say hi to my daughter. Um, but bringing it to real talk in a little bit more approachable format, so people can just do a Q&A with us. And so, guys, really welcome the opportunity. Just know that there's still a lot that we don't know, and I think today is going to be a great opportunity to discuss those items as well. But Justin, we appreciate your time. You spent several hours today with Texas Realtors staff and leadership talking about this subject, so we've got a lot of good things to bring. First and foremost, maybe let's just talk about, in a very high level, where we're at right now with kind of our short timeline, and not the big timeline that NAR has that we're going to show you in just a little bit, but where are we kind of at in this settlement proposal process on a high level?
Yeah. So it seems almost impossible to imagine that it was a mere 13 days ago or something like that this settlement agreement came down. You remember I had just gotten back from the Association Executives Institute at NAR that Friday morning, email at 5:40 a.m. telling me to be on a 6:30 a.m. phone call for the announcement. As we get on the call, right, it hits the New York Times before NAR can tell anybody, right?
Sure.
We at MetroTex were in that first group. And so it was merely 13 days ago that all of this started. So that's a very important timeline piece for us to remember as we think about where we're going and the questions we're trying to answer. This is very fresh. And as I've said 100 times now, and everybody's gonna get sick of hearing me say it, we're getting some clear guidelines on what we can't do. The settlement agreement has been very clear, and now we're in the process of determining what we can do. The most important timeline to consider is the first week of May. So nothing can really happen until the first week of May, at which point the National Association of Realtors will meet. And that's when we're going to get the formal written rules that we'll be required to implement sometime later this summer. Additionally, there's a meeting occurring next week, or actually this week, in Chicago with the NAR MLS Advisory Group. That's a very important meeting. Two of our MetroTex leaders are there. Johnny Moad, our president-elect, and Kathy Faulkner, our MLS director, are both part of that MLS advisory group in Chicago, and we're blessed to have them in those positions. And then also the Texas Realtors Forms Committee meets, I think, just in 2 days.
April 4th.
April 4th. So those are two key meetings that are happening that we should be keeping an eye on. And of course, there's a lot of other timeline considerations, but that's sort of like the most immediate things that we need to be worried about from a timeline perspective. Texas Realtors on forms, NAR on MLS, and then a lot of that I expect will be finalized before we leave the May meetings.
So, Justin, we already have a zinger of a question. And Karen, it's really not a zinger. It's just at the top of the show. But where are the funds coming from that they are paying out, and who gets the funds? So I know that's a little bit of a loaded one. So answer to the best of your knowledge. So we're talking about the $418 million settlement specifically from NAR. I would assume, Karen, that's what you're discussing. So maybe talk a little bit about where the expectation of where they're getting the $418 million.
Yeah, very, very common question. The easiest answer is from their reserves and from their investments over the last many decades. The National Association of Realtors like many trade associations, have been pretty good stewards of the members' dollars, and they've built very healthy reserves. The National Association of Realtors has also made some very key investments. You may be aware that they were one of the initial investors in DocuSign, and when that went to IPO, NAR made a pretty nice penny off that public offering. They also own companies like Central Lock, the second leading lockbox company in the nation. And so NAR has a lot of assets. And so the expectation is, at least at first blush, that NAR will be able to pay this settlement out of money that it already has. The settlement is structured over 4 years. So there's a pretty significant, I think it's 140-ish million that's due once the settlement is agreed to and signed by all parties, and then the judge approves it. And then subsequent $72 million payments, I believe, in the next 2 years, and then the remainder of the balance in year 4. Everything we're hearing from the National Association of Realtors is that that's a number that they can afford. And they have committed, at least in every meeting that I've been in, that there will be no dues increase as a result of the settlement. I do want everybody to keep in mind, though, that a year ago, the National Association of Realtors voted to automatically apply a CPI, right, a consumer price index, a cost of living adjustment to their dues annually. And so it's unclear whether or not that CPI will be applied to the 2025 dues. Right now, I would make the assumption that it will. So we might expect a $3 or $4 dues increase based on that CPI, but I don't believe it'll have any. It has nothing to do with the settlement. It was something that they'd already been planning in adjusting for cost of living.
Yeah, and Karen, to that point, unfortunately, we're not fully privy to how the settlement dollars are going to be divvied. From that standpoint, I think the thing that we obviously can disseminate from that side is that part of the negotiation for the settlement was to find a number that NAR could physically support. And with the unfortunate judgment that we did hear in October, it was going to be cost prohibitive for NAR to continue to fight, post a bond for appeal without having to go to extreme measures of liquidating assets, so on and so forth, because that was in the billions of dollars range. So from what we know right now, this is something that is completely payable, like to Justin's point, without a dues increase to account for that or an assessment to account for that. And even today, Justin, when we were at the Texas Realtors 360 for our region, that was something that was brought up as well. Does it look like that Texas Realtors will be likely doing any type of dues increase or assessment? And overall, it was no. Right now, it looks like there's not going to be one in the future, and I think that's information that everybody needs to be mindful of.
And actually, to follow up, I do want to address the second half of Karen's question, which is, where who gets the funds, and we don't know for sure, but generally speaking, the members of the class, right, which is in theory based on this being a nationwide settlement, every person in America that sold a home on the MLS for the last 4 years, more or less, would be a member of the class. And then the attorneys that represented that class across all the copycats. And so what we don't know is how those funds will be divided amongst the attorneys of the various copycat suits. And we don't know to what degree they'll be divided up among the different classes from those copycat suits. And the $418 million from NAR would go into the hopper, if you will, with the settlements made by Anywhere, the settlements made by Keller Williams, the settlements made by the other corporate defendants, and any subsequent corporate settlements that may be forthcoming. And at that point would be divvied up among the class members and the attorneys that represented them.
So, and Ebony has a comment that kind of leads into a question for us, which is commissions have always been negotiable, at least in recent decades, right? Doing business now, but it does seem as though the general public have been made to believe this means pay your agent less, while the cost of for what agents do business may increase. When we've talked about, nobody is escaping inflation. And that's cost of services that agents provide as well. So I think, that's from the association side, Justin, where we're having a lot of talks behind the scenes of what we can do, not only for our realtor members, but for internal and external marketing for that consumer. So let's talk about that for just a second, and then Harmon, we will get to you, sir. I promise. In regards to what we can do as far as the public perception of what the agent does.
Yeah, I mean, like you, Ebony, I am immensely frustrated with the way that the mainstream media, or really at this point, just about anybody in the media, has reported the settlement. Right? They have chosen time and again to give the most salacious headline, and to quote, averages, or even gone so far as to a certain industry standard where we know none exists, at a number that we also know no longer exists, right? The average, that's not even the average. And so that's been incredibly frustrating. And so there's no question that we have got to do something to reclaim the narrative within the media. And I would argue, even more importantly, just among the public, right?
Yes.
This day and age, fighting the war in the media is a challenge, but that's where social media and other forms of information distribution become incredibly valuable. And we've got to go to the members of the public and start to communicate about why what we know to be true is different than what's being reported in the media. The challenge there is we're still understanding how things are going to evolve, right? It's hard to go talk about what things are going to look like when we don't really know just yet.
Right.
So we want to be very cautious that before we start spending, your dues dollars, making that case, that we know what case we're making. We know that there's inaccuracy in the reporting, but as we go and clarify the record, we want to make sure we understand how real estate's going to function moving forward. And although I would guess that Ashley and I would be in agreement that we don't think it's going to change drastically,
Right.
it is going to change, right? There is no question it's going to change. And so we've got to understand that more. And that's really that timeline I talked about of the next 2 weeks. And then the next 4 weeks are going to be really critical for us to understand how the industry is likely to evolve. And there are conversations going on every day right now about how we're going to evolve that messaging over the next month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and really well into the future.
No, and what I will say is I want to address everybody in the chat. Peggy, I hear you. That's a frustrating sentiment. That stuff like that has been circulating. What I would say is we can't really focus on how the trial went, what the prep that went into it, the jury composition, the judgment. What I think we have to talk about now is going forward and how we position ourselves for success and what we do best. And that is advocating for home ownership and building generational wealth. And Harmon, I would come back to your question, sir. What benefit did Joe Blow Realtor get out of this settlement? I too share some of that candor when we were talking about this. And so, I think from a baseline, and you're not going to want to hear it, it gives us a pathway to get back to doing business in a format in which, quite frankly, the Department of Justice has had a lot of conversations around the real estate business. I mean, we heard obviously today from Texas Realtors that to think that with the economic impact that real estate brings to this country and to this world, that they wouldn't want to have a couple of ideas of how we do business. I think our NAR's goal was to also kind of cut the head off the snake, Philip, and we'll get to your question too, with the copycat lawsuits that were continuing to go on. So it wasn't just about the initial lawsuits brought forth to NAR and to some of the larger brokerage and holding companies, but Justin, we obviously, unfortunately, fell victim to that as well, being named in 2 copycat lawsuits here in Texas. So maybe let's talk about that. It's not going to satisfy Harmon's desire to know how it exceptionally helps us, but let's kind of talk about some of those things that helps us get that pathway.
I will say the one thing it does for the average realtor on the street, and it's not fun necessarily, but it provides some certainty. And to me, that is something that we were going to struggle with until this was resolved.
Right.
And if not for this settlement agreement, it would not have been resolved for a substantial period of time. So NAR has said very clearly that they could not afford to post the bond to appeal the Sitzer-Burnett decision. And to Peggy's question, we can be so frustrated about the way the court case went. And I like, yes,
Agreed.
like we are that, but that ship sailed 6 months ago. And so NAR could not afford to appeal, which meant their only option was to bankrupt or to settle. And if they had bankrupted, or even if they could have afforded the appeal, every other copycat lawsuit, of which I believe there are 35 at last count, would have continued, which meant that every team leader that did substantial business, right? There were just team leaders, agents in Texas that were named in the QJ team lawsuit.
Yes.
Every broker that did a substantial business would be vulnerable to being named in additional copycat lawsuits. And so what this provides is certainty that at least for the sell side, right? Now the buy side's another matter, but at least for the sell side, we have some certainty that those copycats are unlikely to continue. And we know what the rule changes are moving forward. Are they frustrating? Perhaps, yes. Are they going to make real estate a little bit less efficient? I think no question. But at least they are a path forward. And that certainty, I don't think, should be something that we dismiss.
Right.
Clarity is valuable. And so, again, we can be frustrated, but it is an opportunity for us to take the next step. And what I'm very excited about being CEO at MetroTex, I know Ashley's very excited about as our president, is we're in a position to help impact what real estate of the future looks like.
Yes.
Unlike many organizations around the country, they're going to feel like they don't have the opportunity to impact it. Being here at MetroTex, one of the fifth largest association in the country, we're in a position to actually make an impact, and we're super excited about that opportunity.
We are. And Philip, to your question, will MetroTex need to beef up our budget for legal fees since we are fighting separate lawsuits? That's something that, we are hopeful. We still have to go through the motions on our side, correct, Justin, in regards to what this settlement did. And that was create an umbrella of coverage and basically consolidate even the copycat lawsuits to come under that umbrella of coverage. So maybe let's talk about that just really quickly for a second. And then to Philip's point, talking about, just like we've talked about with dues with NAR, are we looking to recover any of those costs that we've already, put out there, or would possibly need to in the future?
Yeah, a couple of things there. So it would be very easy for us to say that, oh, we're covered under the settlement, everything's kind of hunky-dory. I would say that the intent of the settlement is to cover the lawsuit that MetroTex is currently facing here in Texas. But there is a process that we'll have to go through to secure that release, if you will. And I don't want to speculate about that, how long it may take, what the process may be. But I will say from NAR's perspective, the intent was to cover us in the release. But we've got to go through a process. In terms of how that may affect our budget, I will say that your leadership at MetroTex made a lot of really good decisions over the last 10 years to ensure that we bought up into NAR's additional antitrust coverage. And so thus far, we have been able to access NAR's antitrust insurance to cover our legal bills thus far. And we have been able to extend that insurance coverage. If we had not bought that coverage in 2018, 16, I forget what year it was, we would not be covered, right? And we would have been coming out of pocket for these legal expenses. So thankfully, some good decisions made years and years and years ago have really set us up for success. Do we anticipate having ongoing legal fees? Probably, but at least we will continue to be covered for now, as far as we're aware, under NAR's insurance coverage. But we should always be prepared to have to potentially come out of pocket for legal expenses. Again, the good news is your leadership at MetroTex for many, many years has been great stewards of your dollars. And so we have reserves, and that's what reserves are for. They're there to help us deal with these potential challenges. So from a legal fee perspective, I'm extremely confident of where we sit and don't have any anxiety about it at all.
That's wonderful. Ebony, thank you for joining us as well. And feel free to watch the rest of the show later on when you can. Appreciate the follow-up, Philip. And those are all good questions, because what we want to do is be able to answer them. And we don't want people to assume. And so we appreciate you guys sending those to us. Harmon, it does complicate in a way for first-time home buyers, which is, yes, a large amount of the swath of business for a lot of our practitioners. And I kind of want to touch that. I want to touch on that really quickly from a practitioner side, and I am one. I'm right there with you, Harmon, and understanding that. What I would say is, again, it hasn't changed. I think we're going under this guide that because the commissions are negotiable, which they were a year ago as well, and now we're taking out the field on MLS, and I think that's what we need to highlight. This does not prohibit a seller from offering buyer agent compensation, cooperative compensation. What it is prohibiting is to advertise that in a data field or on the MLS as it stands, which it was there. That was the unilateral offer of compensation, whether it was $1, whether it was, a percentage or what that was. At least there was transparency or understanding what that is. And Harmon, that is not changing. That ability to offer that is still there. I think maybe, and Justin, you can chime in on that as well. I think it's removing that transparency, that upfront transparent piece. Is really giving a lot of anxiety, and rightfully so, right? I mean, it's already hard with inaffordability, interest rates going up, insurance rates going up, the rate of appreciation, specifically in North Texas, so every time we turn around, it seems like buyers are just taking it on the chin. And now this is one more thing that buyers are having to really consider. But I would also argue with our buyer representation agreements also out, and we're very lucky to have those agreements in Texas, but that was always something that the buyer had to consider. They made an agreement with you as the representative and them being represented that this is what you charge, and I will be responsible to pay it if the seller isn't offering the fee in which you charge. So it's not fully changing it. It is, but Justin, what say you from, the non-practitioner side of understanding?
Yeah, I think I used the word earlier, and I think it's the best word I can find, and it's efficiency. Like, there is
Right.
no question, right, that this is going to make the transaction a little less efficient.
Sure.
It's going to require an extra phone call, and love listing agents dearly. We have a lot of tools so they don't have to return phone calls, right? Like showing services and things like that. It's going to increase that call volume to listing agents. It's going to increase the requirement for agents to communicate. By the way, I haven't met a real estate agent in the last 15 years who hasn't said, I wish we communicated more. Because right? Like, I wish more people
Yeah.
called me back. I wish more people, replied to my text messages. I mean, this is going to require an additional level of communication between agents.
Yep.
So there's a silver lining to that, right? Like, I think that may be a positive for a business that is primarily relational. But I think there's no question it'll make it less efficient. There's no question it'll make it a little bit harder for first-time buyers, not necessarily to get the fees of their agent paid for. I still think there will be plenty of opportunities for that. But it will make it less accessible, right? Less easy to understand, because there's going to be some additional hoops to jump through. And that's where the forms that we're going to be developing with Texas Realtors in communication with NAR and others, to ensure that not only do the contracts reflect the new patterns that they're going to have to reflect, but that they do it in a really accessible way, right? Accessible language is going to be super important in these contracts, and really good training to help you all explain them in the most accessible way possible. Because when things are less efficient, people get frustrated and then they go away. And
Yep.
the last thing we want are buyers to feel like they don't have opportunities to own a home, because we know how many great things in our community happen because people own property.
So it's like Karen teed us up or something, Justin, and she said, does this settlement change our contracts? And at the top of the show, we kind of talked about that Texas Realtors has a forms task force that is having their first meeting in 2 days. So April 4th, they are on top of it. We found out today what those forms that they are going to be focusing on. And, the ones that you guys are really concerned about right now are the buyer representation agreement, the listing representation agreement between brokers, broker referral agreements, intermediary assignments, independent contractor agreements, and they'll also be looking at the unimproved land contract. So yes, to your point, Karen, there will need to be some language changed in all of that, and I think that is something that, again, being one of, I think, like 18 states, so under 20 states that actually has promulgated forms, we were already so blessed to have so much of this stuff that was already teed up. Specifically the buyer representation agreement. Justin, you just came from an area where it wasn't common practice to use a buyer representation agreement. So, in that, and not demonizing other areas, but gosh, we are very blessed, again, to be in Texas and to be so far ahead of that we are looking at changing our forms, not creating new ones from scratch.
Yeah, and making sure our forms work together well, right?
Yes.
And that's, again, I also just came from a state where not only are buyer rep agreements not widely used, there are also 14 different purchase contracts that are used in the state, right? So, like, God bless Texas, right? We're in a much better position to roll with this, where we have one contract that's widely used throughout the state. We have a buyer rep agreement that, if not universally used, is widely used. And we already have a lot of training around it, right? And so I think we're in a really good position. But yeah, there's no question there's going to have to be some changes. And my guess is there will be an evolution of changes. I don't think we're going to change it once and then say, okay, we're good. My guess is we'll make an initial change, track how it's working, like we do with everything else. And then if we feel that there's a shortfall, right, we're going to make those recommendations to improve moving forward. I would also expect on the buyer rep agreement side, there is likely going to be a conversation at the state level across the various licensing authorities throughout the country to probably make a decision whether or not the buyer form may be something that the state licensing authority gets involved with, the same way they have with the purchase contracts. I know, for example, I showed Ashley today, the state of Colorado has a mandatory buyer rep form that's promulgated by the licensing body. And so, we'll have to wait and see whether that's something that would evolve here.
And I think the biggest thing that I want to kind of hone in on was from things that we learned, again, today, statistic wise, because if we can look at where trends were going even last year, in a different market. So in 2023, Texas Realtors just provided us with the Texas home buyers and sellers study, which we will put the full link to that here in the chat so you guys can look at that yourselves. And I think that's really important, is to kind of look at trends and facts and to help us, because we don't have a crystal ball, but let's see what the temperament and everything has been in this marketplace. And I think, see, there we go, right up there. One specifically that I thought really stood out to me was polling sellers. How did you find your agent? How did you elect to, where did you find them? And 43% were referred by a friend, neighbor, or relative. And then 26% used an agent they had previously used. So you're talking about nearly 70% of the sellers chose their agent by some sort of warm lead source, by referral or from a previous transaction. And so that's why I keep on honing in. We really need to focus from a positive standpoint on the rule, not the exception. There were still 30% of sellers that found their agents in other means, and whether that was, a cold lead source or an online lead source or something else, yes, but 70% did some sort of referral-based business. And then the same thing on the buyer side, it was almost identical. I think it was a little bit less, but it was 46% were referred by a relative, a friend, and then 14% used an agent previously. So for me, from the practitioner side, that means relationships still went out. And when you have an actual relationship or referred to by somebody that does, we can have those critical conversations, Harmon, that sit there and talk about professional service fees and what those look like, and how the process is going to go, and speak about our representation agreements. It is a lot harder to do it with a stranger off the street. Doesn't mean you can't. But I thought those stats were really comforting to me, Justin, when we were looking at those today.
Yeah, and it's a little bit of a like kind of an off like a turn here, but I do think it's worth discussing because at the end of the day, real estate is a relationship business, and it's a relationship business that has always had a multitude of business models. Now, it has not always had a multitude of business models that are used equally, but it has
Right.
always had a multitude of business models. And I think one of the other stats in that report was that, especially on the list side, there have always been, different levels of service. We've had full service listing agents, we've had sort of middle service listing agents, we've had a fee for listing on the MLS service, and
Yep.
then of course there's always been the option to go just FISBO, right? So, and those opportunities have always been there. And what we found is at the end of the day, most people want to hire an agent that they know, like, and trust. And we have a ton of evidence over decades that on the listing side, that's what's going to happen. There are all these business models, and they're going to, at the end of the day, work with somebody they know, like, and trust. That's going to happen on the buy side too. There's going to be some different business models that emerge. But I have every confidence that consumers are going to continue to work with people who they know, like, and trust, and pay them a fee for the service that they feel they were delivered. Because we have a ton of evidence on the listing side that that's how it's worked forever.
So, and specifically what Justin was talking about was level of service provided by agent. And so 80% of sellers elected to use an agent that provided a broad range, or like we like to call full service representation. 12% used limited set of services, and 8% hired agents just to purely put the listing on the MLS and do very few additional services. So 80% still wanted that full broad range service model, whereas 20% elected to go into different service models. I mean, that's exponential, Justin, from that standpoint. And again, that just shows that people covet what we're providing, but we have to articulate that unique value proposition when we're asking somebody to sign a contract to provide service fees for the professional representation that we're offering. You're asking for somebody to say, hey, I'm with you, Justin. I'm going to pay you for everything that you're bringing me, but could you tell me what you're actually bringing to the table? That's all that we're having to really articulate a little bit more on that side. Nobody's going to work for free. And I think that's really what I want, our members and people to take from here. Nobody should work for free, and nobody is going to work for free. And we really need to kind of paradigm shift that lens just a little bit.
Yeah, and when we were at our general membership meeting a couple days ago or a week ago, I talked quite a bit about the realtor as a financial advisor. And I would argue a realtor is the best bargain you'll ever have in a financial advisor. When you buy a property with an agent and they advise you on on what the right price is, where the best place for you to be is relative to your goals, they're getting you into a property that is going to grow. If it's your primary residence, that asset will grow in value tax free. You pay your agent once, and that asset continues to grow. Where every other financial advisor, you buy an asset and then you keep paying them to manage that asset over time. And I've done the math, right? I've done the math, and an agent is a absolute not pennies, quarters on the dollar
Yeah.
to what you would pay a traditional financial advisor to grow your money and to grow your investment in the same way. And so I just think we need to reposition the agent. And we've always sold real estate from a very emotional perspective. And I don't want to ever get away from that. I mean, gosh, handing the keys to a first-time home buyer is magical. But we also have to really talk about the financial advice. The real estate is the single most transformative financial transaction. It is the way that people build wealth. It is the way people send their kids to college. It's the way they retire. We need to lean into that, right? We need to talk about the financial tools we are helping people develop. That is what real estate agents have been doing for 100 years, but we've not done a good job of communicating that value to the consumer.
Well, and I think a big part of that, Justin, is we always, we talk about I think sometimes the consumer feels like the closing table is the divorce. And really that's just the start of the relationship, to your point. There's a whole cycle of an ecosystem of what goes on. And that was my point to you from the practitioner side, which was, articulate to my clients, whether it's with an investor or somebody that's looking at a primary residence, or maybe it is a commercial transaction, but you're talking about the acquisition, helping them purchase is only the first piece of the puzzle. And how many times do you get a phone call, or when we're, trying to follow up with the client, hey, it's a year in, how are things going? Oh my gosh, Ashley, you know what? Everything's great. I think we're finally going to get to that pergola on the patio that we talked about when we wanted to buy the house. But we wanted your recommendation. What are you seeing? Because like we talked about, we might be relocating back to the East Coast in a few years. What are people looking at in their enclosed patios? Can we do an open pergola? Do we need to have a fully covered one? Hey, the mosquitoes are horrible here. Do we need to make sure we have netting in a door? What does that look like for you? And me giving that advice. Or how about right now? We're in that lovely season of assessments being mailed out by the appraisal districts. And ooh, do our phones love to ring during that time? Oh my gosh, what did you do to me? My assessment went up $70,000, and my comments always, congratulations, your asset grew. That's not what they want to hear. But then they're looking at me to say, hey, is there anything I can do? Can we look at comps? Because maybe there's some adjustments that need to be made on the assessed value before we get to what that tax bill is going to look at. That's another touch point. So all of these things, I constitute that as asset management. And we're going through that part of the ecosystem. And then when it comes down to it, and they're sitting there and saying, you know what, we're going to relocate, we're going to level up, we're going to do something else. Kids are going to college and we're going to downsize. Now I'm part of the disposition phase. Then I get to give them advice on what's going to maximize their net proceeds on disposing of that asset. And I think that's where, again, if we can go away a little bit from the emotional and talk about the life cycle of this investment and what that looks like as a partnership, then that's a lot easier to articulate that value proposition. And again, you're only paying me up front. You're only paying me the way I charge my professional services on the fact that there is actually a transaction that transpires. This isn't an ongoing fee.
Now, mind you, do I think it's possible that there are some new business models that may emerge?
Sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Harmon, just in the chat, and I know I'm not supposed to look at the chat, but I can't help
You're
myself.
not, and your eyeballs keep on going there.
Well,
and I want to.
There's good comments.
There are good comments.
So Harmon just said, the cost of appreciation has more than covered, our professional fees over the last few years. And what I would argue is that in the history of real estate has never done anything but this, right? There have been years where it has flatlined a little bit. There have been years where it's dipped a little bit, but over a time period, it's just like the stock. If you wait, right, real estate does nothing but go up. I think that's something we should stand behind. I don't want to lose sight though. I mean, I'm the one that talks about this financial advisor role, but don't forget, right? At the end of the day, a realtor is also a psychologist. They are also a marriage counselor. They are also there's so much value that each and every one of you brings to a transaction. And everybody's going to have a different skill set.
Yes.
But I don't think everybody in this future is going to have to level up a little bit. I think that's just the reality. There's been so much attention now focused on the industry. And it is a great opportunity to sharpen those skills, which is why I think it's going to be so important for everybody in the industry to make sure they have the right partners. And at MetroTex, we want to make sure that we're that right partner. And we're super committed to being your partner to help you get where you need to be.
I love that, Justin. Look at how you tied that up in a little bit bow, landing that plane back to the association. And Harmon, yes, we do wear many hats. And sir, it looks like you like to wear a hat as well. And you look very good in that. My head's a little large, so I'm probably not going to do that anytime soon. But no, let's go back to some of the things that we can also give from, a standpoint, things that we hear circulating right now. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen to open houses? That's something that I'm seeing a lot of information, and I would say a lot of it's misinformation, and open houses, because we're talking about the fact that to show the home, that you are going to have that buyer representation agreement signed to give you access to go and show that home through the MLS. So that means, what happens with an open house? Does every single person coming through the door have to sign a buyer representation agreement?
So I will tell you what I've heard, and then I will say, oh, I don't know. What was communicated to us from Texas Realtors today is that their belief is that an open house is a public function that would not require a buyer who's walking in to look at that property to sign a buyer rep agreement. That makes sense to me, and seems reasonable. But I would say I think we don't really know yet how that might evolve, but I certainly don't think that's the intent. I don't think anything in this settlement agreement would mean to try to discourage the practice of open houses. In fact, I would argue open houses are one of the most powerful fair housing tools we have. They literally make the home open to anybody who wants to come look at it. Anything that would discourage open houses, I would just think would be terrible, and would only seek to make inventory less accessible. So I'm not real worried about open houses. Another one that comes up a lot, Ashley, is, well, what happens if they're buying a property sight unseen? Certainly during COVID, certainly coming out of COVID,
Yeah.
certainly with limited inventory, people are writing contracts without even seeing a property. Well, what's the timing of a buyer rep agreement if there's no tour, right? The settlement just talks about tour, which is such a clear example to me that this was written by attorneys who don't sell real estate. Because
Sure.
we all know there are so many ways that properties go under contract, or that clients engage their real estate professional in a transaction that don't involve necessarily a tour of a home.
So to that point, we're still trying to get full clarity, but Philip, to your point too, yes, agents are concerned about the open house. It's open to the public. And I think that's something that we need to be careful, and that we don't demonize that practice, to Justin's point, that it is an amazing fair housing tool and opening it up to the public consumer. And so as more information or best practices come about, you can be known that we are going to help disseminate those additional information and those tools to you guys. So I think that's really important. Another thing, Justin, that we're hearing a lot is the financing of commissions, just like closing costs and other fees, to Harmon's point, to the buyer, that they're having to come out of pocket. And that was something too that we heard today, that those conversations that dialogue's already being opened with Fannie and Freddie. But obviously we know those institutional cogs can take a minute to start moving. But NAR is still having those conversations right now, because I know those are grave concerns over financing restrictions and requirements.
I think one of the things that, when I hear this commissions being financed question, I get confused a little bit, right? Because I'm never quite sure where the question's coming from. Today, when someone buys a property and it is financed, a portion of the amount that is financed ends up in the seller's pocket, and out of that proceeds is paid the agents, right? So you could argue today that the commissions are being financed, although they're not technically. So I'm never quite clear whether people are asking, well, commissions can't work that way anymore. And commissions absolutely can continue to work that way. The settlement agreement secured that a commission can continue to be paid by the seller to the buyer's agent the way it's always been done, which means the financing tools that have been available to us forever will continue to be available. Now, if the seller refuses to pay the buyer agent commission today, could buyer agent commissions be financed? And I think the answer is no. I do know that there are ongoing conversations with Fannie and Freddie and FHA and VA and all the rest about what it might look like to permit that. And as you said, those wheels are going to be slow to move. But I do know that NAR is actively engaged in those conversations right now, along with the understanding that right now a veteran is not even permitted to pay a buyer's agent, right? Which is another conversation that's ongoing. So, and then understanding how those might interact with concessions as well, it gets pretty complicated pretty quick, and there are a lot of different levers to pull. And like I said, I'm confident NAR is having those conversations. Whether or not they're going to have progress on them, I think remains to be seen.
So Kristen's point was they increased the sales price to cover the commission. This was a main problem in the lawsuits. You know, the increased cost to do business in real estate and where that cost was being passed off to was the main crux of that. But I would caution people from thinking that we're increasing the sales price to back in fees and other things like that from that side. It's what the seller is wanting to walk out of a transaction with from a net proceeds standpoint. And when I go to a seller and I say, look, here's what the market comparables are, and here's where I think we need to be. But here's also the things that we're going to need to do. We're going to need to do $12,000 worth of flooring. I think we're going to need to look at doing about $15,000 worth of interior paint. X, Y, and Z, all of the costs that go into marketing this home for sale. And then from there, the seller with a cooperative conversation is sitting there and saying, here's where I need to walk away from the transaction from. And so all of those marketing expenses and getting that house market ready are then taken into consideration and backed out of that. And so commissions are the one that everybody's highlighting that, okay, it's increasing the unaffordability or the sales. It's one of those things, though, that I think we need to be careful. The inaffordability is what's driving a lot of this and what those costs are. And so Kristen's point is that's literally what they were doing. Excuse it how you want, but that's the discussion that's still happening in the groups and in person. Don't bury their heads in the sand. Hey, you know what? I appreciate that there are bad actors or people that are having conversations that are maybe not positive for the marketplace. But at the same time, Justin, I'll let you chime in here as well. I would sit there and say that there are services that are being rendered and services that are being paid for on both sides for there to be representation and those professional services to be offered. And nobody's going to work for free, so they have to be taken into consideration in one form or another.
Yeah. As I said, this conversation can get really murky really quickly.
Correct.
What I will emphasize, so I grew up in this business. I've been adjacent to real estate since I was a very young child. And so I am so encouraged by almost every question that we're getting about commissions is really coming from a place of, I represent buyers who desperately need representation. And
Right.
I know that if they do not have representation, they will not have the outcomes that they want. And so, I think it'd be really easy for an outsider to listen to this conversation and say, this is a bunch of real estate agents trying to figure out how to continue to make a living. And I would say, sure, that's a piece of it. But the more substantial piece is we want to make sure that buyers can continue to be represented in the largest financial transaction the vast majority of them will make. And I know that's where the place that most of these questions are coming from. And that's where the urgency is coming from, because everybody's thinking like, man, come August, come September, when these are in place and these buyers that I've been working with. I mean, Ashley, you were telling me about a buyer you were working with who's a veteran, single mother, 2 kids, $300,000, all these challenges that she's facing. And it's like, well, come August, does that get harder? Right? Yeah. Come September, does that get harder? And I know that's where it's coming from. And so the only thing I will say is I think we all just need to kind of take a breath and acknowledge that we don't have all these answers right now. And gosh, does it pain me to not have the answers? I love to have the answers. But when we try to figure out like the mechanisms of how these are going to interact on a closing statement, how they're going to interact on a truth in lending, how they're going to interact, on the mortgage resale market, how an appraiser is going to handle it. Gosh, there are just so many little nuances that we're going to have to address over the next 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 18 weeks, 24 weeks, right? This is going to be an ongoing conversation. I believe so strongly that at every level of this, even some of the attorneys that, brought these cases, who I don't love,
they're not going to get a Christmas card.
They're not going to get a Christmas card. But I really believe that nobody doesn't think buyers should be represented. And ultimately, I have a lot of faith, and maybe my faith is misplaced, but I can't go through life without faith that the work of our 100-year-old trade association and a bunch of brokers and agents that care way more than they should sometimes, are going to make sure that buyers and sellers come out of this represented, protected, and that an industry that makes up 16 to 20% of our GDP can continue to make up 16 to 20% of our GDP. No one wants to disrupt that. Some attorneys saw an opportunity, and we need to make sure that we do the work we have to do to ensure that this incredible industry gets to keep moving forward.
And I think a big portion of it also is education, Justin. As we heard today, 45% of our members of Texas Realtors throughout the state have joined since the pandemic started. And that means nearly half of our realtors in the state of Texas haven't seen another market than the last 4 years. And that looks really different too. And I think that's what comes back to, we don't replace the brokerage, education and training. But it really comes down to education, as Gerard just said, of course. And that's what we can do supplementally to our brokerage partners, to offer really great resources and forums and trainings, and bring those to you guys so we can make sure that we can go out there and do what we're charged with. And that's to advocate on behalf of buyers and sellers alike. We know that's the best way to build generational wealth and to help position themselves for their future. And that's something that we will continue to do. And we can't lose sight of that, I think, as the organization, and to help people refocus how they're talking in the public as well. Guys, what we do is important. And I think Peggy was just saying some buyers don't even know that they need representation. Well, guess what? We need to get out there. We need to explain to them why they need to be represented. And we need to be more vocal about those things and shouting them from the rooftops.
And Ashley, I guarantee you that any realtor that's been in the business for a period of time has seen a FSBO, and they've gone and talked to that FSBO and convinced that FSBO that they need an agent, because they do. And the same, and I would just say that same there are going to be buyers that have that same mentality. And we're going to have to talk to them about the services that are being provided and why it's so important for them to go represent it through a transaction. It's this, to me, it's the same paradigm that'll just be now mirrored on the buy side.
Gosh, I think we've talked about this too, Justin, at the peak of the market in 2021, where you had 100 people lining up outside a door, and a buyer thought, if I go directly to the listing agent, maybe I can cut through that line, right? Maybe I can get to the top of the pile. And in all reality, that didn't help, because also listing agents and sellers knew that a represented buyer was the best teammate, that best team to make sure that they had that win-win transaction and got the best result to get over that finish line in most circumstances. And I think we have to consider that now, that there will be some, to your point, that will still choose to be unrepresented, that will go directly to the listing agent. But we have had FSBOs, we have had those things in the marketplace already, where people are foregoing representation on both sides. That's not going to change. Going back to the statistics, where 70% of sellers were choosing their agent based on some sort of relationship, that's huge, guys, to be able to have those critical conversations of what is going to be the best thing to offer to get the best result. We call that, whether it's a cooperative compensation fee, a professional service fee, whatever we want to call that, offering closing costs, offering, anything like that from a marketing side. Those are conversations that you need to be able to have with your seller. And when 70% are choosing them based on some sort of relationship, man, I like those odds. Absolutely. So I think, yeah, for sure. So we've got a few minutes left. I know, the big portion of this was to be able to educate the people that were tuning in and sitting on here with, facts, but also some good takeaways of what they can expect. And Justin, I know we're preparing for ourselves over the next several weeks of what that's going to look like. You had talked again about at the top of the show, about our timeline. You're welcome, Kristen. You know, in May is kind of going to be a trigger point where we're not going to necessarily have the full, approval of the proposals that have been set, but we might have maybe a better understanding of what those policy adoptions are. So can we talk about that as we kind of close out a little bit?
Yeah. So like every other rule change that NAR has made over the years, right? They're going to go through a committee process, through a board of directors process. Those policies will be approved at the May board meeting. At MetroTex, acknowledging that we think that is a key decision point, we are planning a broker summit forum, call it what you will, the week after that, to really have a very open dialogue here at MetroTex. We're going to bring in some speakers from all over to be available to really address some of the challenges that we expect to come out of that May meeting. And then we're beginning in June, where we're planning a buyer agent series to help agents more effectively work with buyers. We had already been planning that, but the curriculum will be substantially changing as a result of this. And so those are at least the steps that we're going to take in advance of July and August, where we expect these rules to be implemented per a preliminary settlement approval. And once the settlement is preliminarily approved, there's 60 days from then is when things have to start happening, right?
So that's important to understand. And yes, we just put our event calendar up there in the chat as well, so you guys can stay up to date and know when those things are going on. And of course, something else that is really important, that's a really kind of real-time tool that we're using besides Real Talk, are our area realtor meetings. And Justin, I know you are going to be at the East Dallas area realtor meeting. I believe, is that tomorrow?
I'll check my calendar. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Days, but I think it's tomorrow. Yeah.
It's this week. But we're going to utilize those area realtor meetings all over the Metroplex to continue to disseminate that information to you guys. And while we don't know everything, even though sometimes we act like we do, what we do know is that when we know, we are going to make sure. Yes, Roxy said it's tomorrow, by the way, Roxy Solis. So thank you, Roxy. But that when we find this information out, that we're not going to keep it secret, guys, that we're going to make sure that our members stay well informed and equipped, to navigate these challenges. And we're really excited. Peggy, hey, I would love to do 3 more hours of this. But you and I can chat offline about some of those things. And what I would say is, guys, just keep educating yourselves. Not that you haven't already, but arm yourself with stats as much as you can, because I think it's real easy, Justin, for us to really go to kind of like worst case scenarios all the time. And what do you like to say, that you've never seen a group of professionals like realtors when they're given a problem? So what is it that you always say?
I don't know. I've said it 100 different ways, but I mean, realtors are professional problem solvers. I mean,
Yes.
It is you give a realtor a rule, they're going to find 15 different ways to comply with it and comply with it creatively. And, I think to that degree, right this minute, we're kind of our own worst enemy, because we're problem solving for a problem we don't fully understand yet. But every realtor is an entrepreneur. Every single one of you. You've chosen this business because you're an entrepreneur. And this is an entrepreneurial moment. It's a moment for change. And we can go back in the history of our industry, and we can look at when the MLS was created, when we finally started putting properties together to collaborate and cooperate around. And the brokers that had market share were like, I don't want to let it go. Letting it go will destroy my business. And then we got rid of the MLS books, and going online was going to destroy the business. And then we got rid of sub agency and went to buyer's agent. And oh my God, how's that going to disrupt the business? And then it was the VOW fight years ago that we were going to have virtual office websites, and that was going to destroy the business. And every single time, realtors have not only thrived, they've thrived beyond what they were before. And I believe that'll happen again. It'll not without some pain. There's no question it won't be without some pain. But I have a real confidence in the realtor spirit. And I know that we've got 25,000 entrepreneurs here at MetroTex. They're going to figure out how to not only make sure that their buyers and sellers are successful, but to thrive, that their businesses will thrive while they do that.
Well, and that's what I want to leave everyone with, as well as, if we have this much uncertainty around a group of amazing professionals, just think what that consumer on the other side that is yearning for that representation on the largest purchase or sale of their lives, and how many are sitting there and saying, I could never have done it without my amazing agent. And there are so many more that deserve that same feeling. And guys, we need to be those positive voices that are cutting through all of this disruptive noise and say, put on your cape, figuratively or realistically, and get out there and do what you do best. And let's advocate for homeownership. Let's advocate for the consumer and our clients, and make sure that we can still do that. So we need to be the positive voices, even though I know there's a lot of uncertainty around this. Make sure that you go to those area realtor meetings. Make sure that there's positive networking groups that you're joining. Don't silo yourself. Don't put yourself on an island right now. Talk to your brokers. Talk to your team leaders. Make sure you're staying plugged in right now, because I'm telling you, just like Justin said, this too shall pass. We will get on the other side. And years from now, we were going to go, oh my gosh, we thought that was the end, but look at us now. We are bigger, we are stronger, and we will prevail. And Justin, we are so appreciative that you are helping us steer the ship at MetroTex, because your positive attitude is radiating through our membership and our staff. And we know that there are prosperous times to come, along with these uncertain times. And we're going to be there for both, guys. And I think, as we can see everybody signing off saying thank you so much, and this was insightful. You got a couple of people that you'll see tomorrow, Justin, at the East Dallas area realtor meeting. But I'm sure we will see Justin again on Real Talk. And Justin, anything else you want to leave our viewers with tonight?
No, as always, it is. I love this industry. I love serving this industry. We're going to do great things together.
All right, guys, go enjoy the rest of your evenings, and we will see you very, very soon.